medical science terminology, general terminology, vertical, 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 intermediate, 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 lateral, 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 anterior, 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 posterior, 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 ventral, 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 dorsal, 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 frontal, 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 occipital, 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 superior, 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 inferior, 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 horizontal, 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 cranial, 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 caudal, 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 rostral, 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 apical, 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 base, basal, base, basal, base, basal, bustler, 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 middle, 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 transverse, 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 longitudinal, 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 axial, 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 median, 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 external, 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 internal, 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 superficial, 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 deep, 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 proximal, 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 distal, 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 central, 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 peripheral, 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 radial, 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 ulnar, 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 coronal, 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 fibular, 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 tibial, 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 palmar, 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 volar, 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 plantar, 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 flexor, 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 extensor, 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 sagittal, 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 right, 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 left, 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 transverse, 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 medial, 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 flexion, 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 hyperextension, 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 adduction, 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 abduction, 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 circumduction, 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 rotation, 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 medial rotation, medial rotation, medial rotation, lateral rotation, lateral rotation, lateral rotation, pronation, 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 supination, 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 opposition, 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 forward flexion, forward flexion, forward flexion, inversion, 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 eversion, 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 elevation, 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 depression, 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 protraction, 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 retraction, 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 constriction, 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 dilatation, 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 backward flexion, backward flexion, backward flexion, lateral flexion, lateral flexion, lateral flexion, dorsal flexion, dorsal flexion, dorsal flexion, palmar flexion, palmar flexion, palmar flexion, dorsal flexion, dorsal flexion, dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, plantar flexion, plantar flexion, extension, 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 origin, 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 insertion, 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 vertebral curvature, vertebral curvature, vertebral curvature, cervical curvature, cervical curvature, cervical curvature, thoracic curvature, thoracic curvature, thoracic curvature, lumbar curvature, lumbar curvature, lumbar curvature, sacral curvature, sacral curvature, sacral curvature, midsternal line, midsternal line, midsternal line, perivertebral line, perivertebral line, perivertebral line, posterior median line, posterior median line, posterior median line, subcostal plane, subcostal plane, subcostal plane, transpyloric plane, transpyloric plane, transpyloric plane, supracristal plane, supracristal plane, supracristal plane, transtubercular plane, transtubercular plane, transtubercular plane, interspinal plane, interspinal plane, interspinal plane, preaxillary line, preaxillary line, preaxillary line, postaxillary line, postaxillary line, postaxillary line, head, 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 frontal region, frontal region, frontal region, parietal region, parietal region, parietal region, occipital region, occipital region, occipital region, temporal region, temporal region, Temporal region. Lateral sternal line, lateral sternal line, lateral sternal line. Face, face, face. Orbital region, orbital region, orbital region. Nasal region, nasal region, nasal region. Oral region, oral region, oral region. Menal region, menal region, menal region. Infraorbital region, infraorbital region, infraorbital region. Buccal region, buccal region, buccal region. Zygomatic region, zygomatic region, zygomatic region. Neck, neck, neck. Anterior triangle of neck, anterior triangle of neck. Anterior triangle of neck. Greater supraclavicular fossa, greater supraclavicular fossa, greater supraclavicular fossa. Knuckle region, knuckle region, knuckle region. Submandibular triangle, submandibular triangle, submandibular triangle. Carotid triangle, carotid triangle, carotid triangle. Muscular triangle, muscular triangle, muscular triangle. Submental triangle, submental triangle, submental triangle. Sternocleidomastoid region, sternocleidomastoid region, sternocleidomastoid region. Lesser supraclavicular fossa, lesser supraclavicular fossa, lesser supraclavicular fossa. Posterior triangle of neck, posterior triangle of neck, posterior triangle of neck. Supraclavicular triangle, supraclavicular triangle, supraclavicular triangle. Chest, chest, chest. Presternal region, presternal region, presternal region. Infraclavicular fossa, infraclavicular fossa, infraclavicular fossa. Clavipectoral triangle, clavipectoral triangle, clavipectoral triangle. Pectoral region, pectoral region, pectoral region. Mammary region, mammary region, mammary region. Inframammary region, inframammary region, inframammary region. Axillary region, axillary region, axillary region. Axilla axillary fossa, axilla axillary fossa, axilla axillary fossa. Abdomen, abdomen, abdomen. Hypochondriac region, hypochondriac region, hypochondriac region. Epigastric region, epigastric region, epigastric region. Lumbar region, lumbar region, lumbar region. Umbilical region, umbilical region, umbilical region. Inguinal region, inguinal region, inguinal region. Pubic region, pubic region, pubic region. Back, back, back. Vertebral region, vertebral region, vertebral region. Sacral region, sacral region, sacral region. Scapular region, scapular region, scapular region. Infrascapular region, infrascapular region, infrascapular region. Lumbar region, lumbar region, lumbar region. Lumbar triangle, lumbar triangle, lumbar triangle. Perineum, perineum, perineum. Anal triangle, anal triangle, anal triangle. Urogenital triangle, urogenital triangle, urogenital triangle. Upper limb, upper limb, upper limb. Deltoid region, deltoid region, deltoid region. Back of elbow, back of elbow, back of elbow. Forearm, forearm, forearm. Front of forearm, front of forearm, front of forearm. Back of forearm, back of forearm, back of forearm. Lateral margin, lateral margin, lateral margin. Medial margin, medial margin, medial margin. Wrist, wrist, wrist. Front of wrist, front of wrist, front of wrist. Back of wrist, back of wrist, back of wrist. Hand, hand, hand. Arm, arm, arm. Dorsum of hand, dorsum of hand, dorsum of hand. Palm of hand, palm of hand, palm of hand. Thunar eminence, thunar eminence, thunar eminence. Hypothunar eminence, hypothunar eminence, hypothunar eminence. Metacarpus, metacarpus, metacarpus. Fingers, fingers, fingers. Thumb first finger, thumb first finger, thumb first finger. Index second finger, index second finger, index second finger. Middle third finger, middle third finger, middle third finger. Ring fourth finger, ring fourth finger, ring fourth finger. Front of arm, front of arm, front of arm. Little fifth finger, little fifth finger, little fifth finger. Palmar surface of fingers, palmar surface of fingers. palmar surface of fingers, dorsal surface of fingers, dorsal surface of fingers, dorsal surface of fingers, back of arm, back of arm, back of arm, elbow, 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 front of elbow, front of elbow, front of elbow, cubital and tecubital fossa, cubital and tecubital fossa, cubital and tecubital fossa, lateral bicipital groove, lateral bicipital groove, lateral bicipital groove, medial bicipital groove, medial bicipital groove, medial bicipital groove, lower limb, lower limb, lower limb, gluteal region, gluteal region, gluteal region, back of knee, back of knee, back of knee, popliteal fossa, popliteal fossa, popliteal fossa, leg, 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 front of leg, front of leg, front of leg, back of leg, back of leg, back of leg, calf, 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 front of ankle, front of ankle, front of ankle, back of ankle, back of ankle, back of ankle, foot, 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 heel, 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 gluteal sulcus, gluteal sulcus, gluteal sulcus, dorsum of foot, dorsum of foot, dorsum of foot, sole of foot, sole of foot, sole of foot, lateral margin of foot, lateral margin of foot, lateral margin of foot, medial margin of foot, medial margin of foot, medial margin of foot, tarsus, 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 metatarsus, 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 toes, 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 great first toe, great first toe, great first toe, second toes, second toes, second toes, third toe, third toe, third toe, coxy, 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 fourth toe, fourth toe, fourth toe, little fifth toe, little fifth toe, little fifth toe, plantar surface of toes, plantar surface of toes, plantar surface of toes, dorsal surface of toes, dorsal surface of toes, dorsal surface of toes, thigh, 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 front of thigh, front of thigh, front of thigh, femoral triangle, femoral triangle, femoral triangle, back of thigh, back of thigh, back of thigh, knee, 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 front of knee, front of knee, front of knee, parasternal line, parasternal line, parasternal line, midclavicular line, midclavicular line, midclavicular line, mammary line, mammary line, mammary line, anterior axillary line, anterior axillary line, anterior axillary line, midaxillary line, midaxillary line, midaxillary line, posterior axillary line, posterior axillary line, posterior axillary line, scapular line, scapular line, scapular line, osteology, 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 general terminology, bony part, bony part, bony part, appendicular skeleton, appendicular skeleton, appendicular skeleton, long bone, long bone, long bone, short bone, short bone, short bone, flat bone, flat bone, flat bone, irregular bone, irregular bone, irregular bone, pneumatic bone, pneumatic bone, pneumatic bone, epiphysis, 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 metaphysis, 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 epiphyseal cartilage, epiphyseal cartilage, epiphyseal cartilage, epiphyseal line, epiphyseal line, epiphyseal line, periostum, 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 diaphysis, 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 articular surface, articular surface, articular surface, marrow cavity, marrow cavity, marrow cavity, yellow marrow, yellow marrow, yellow marrow, red marrow, red marrow, red marrow, nutrient foramen, nutrient foramen, nutrient foramen, nutrient canal, nutrient canal, nutrient canal, ossification center, ossification center, ossification center, primary ossification center, primary ossification center, primary ossification center, secondary ossification center, secondary ossification center, secondary ossification center, endostem, 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 cortical substance, cortical substance, cortical substance, compact bone, compact bone, compact bone, spongy cancellous bone, spongy cancellous bone, spongy cancellous bone, cartilaginous part, cartilaginous part, cartilaginous part, perichondrium, 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 axial skeleton, axial skeleton, axial skeleton, axial skeleton, axial skeleton, axial skeleton, skull, 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 cranial cavity, cranial cavity, cranial cavity, pericranium, 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 grooves for arteries, grooves for arteries, grooves for arteries, sutural bones, sutural bones, sutural bones, outer table, outer table, outer table, diplo, 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 canals diploici, canals diploici, canals diploici, internal layer, internal layer, internal layer. Groove for superior sagittal sinus, groove for superior sagittal sinus, groove for superior sagittal sinus, granular foveoli, granular foveoli, granular foveoli, digital impressions, digital impressions, digital impressions, grooves for veins, grooves for veins, grooves for veins, norma occipitalis, norma occipitalis, norma occipitalis, inion, 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 lambda, 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 floor of cranial cavity interior of skull base, floor of cranial cavity interior of skull base, floor of cranial cavity interior of skull base. Anterior cranial fossa, anterior cranial fossa, anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, posterior cranial fossa, posterior cranial fossa, posterior cranial fossa, clivus, 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 groove for inferior petrosal sinus, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, fontanels, 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 anterior fontanel, anterior fontanel, anterior fontanel, posterior fontanel, posterior fontanel, posterior fontanel, sphenoidal fontanels, sphenoidal fontanels, sphenoidal fontanels, mastoid fontanels, mastoid fontanels, mastoid fontanels, norma verticalis, norma verticalis, norma verticalis, bregma, 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 vertex, 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 occiput, 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 norma frontalis, norma frontalis, norma frontalis, forehead, 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 nosion, 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 nothing, 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 orbit, 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 base of orbit, base of orbit, base of orbit, medial wall, medial wall, medial wall, anterior ethmoidal foramen, anterior ethmoidal foramen, anterior ethmoidal foramen, posterior ethmoidal foramen, posterior ethmoidal foramen, posterior ethmoidal foramen, lacrimal sulcus, lacrimal sulcus, lacrimal sulcus, fossa for lacrimal sac, fossa for lacrimal sac, fossa for lacrimal sac, superior orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure, margin of orbit, margin of orbit, margin of orbit, supraorbital margin, supraorbital margin, supraorbital margin, infraorbital margin, infraorbital margin, infraorbital margin, lateral margin, lateral margin, lateral margin, medial margin, medial margin, medial margin, superior wall, superior wall, superior wall, inferior wall, inferior wall, inferior wall, lateral wall, lateral wall, lateral wall, nasal cavity, nasal cavity, nasal cavity, bony part of nasal septum, bony part of nasal septum, bony part of nasal septum, sphenopalatine foramen, sphenopalatine foramen, sphenopalatine foramen, pleuriform aperture, pleuriform aperture, pleuriform aperture, superior meatus, superior meatus, superior meatus, middle meatus, middle meatus, middle meatus, inferior meatus, inferior meatus, inferior meatus, nasolacrimal canal, nasolacrimal canal, nasolacrimal canal, sphenoethmoidal recess, sphenoethmoidal recess, sphenoethmoidal recess, nasopharyngeal meatus, nasopharyngeal meatus, nasopharyngeal meatus, choani, 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 norma lateralis, norma lateralis, norma lateralis, turion, 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 asterion, 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 gonion, 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 temporal fossa, temporal fossa, temporal fossa, zygomatic arch, zygomatic arch, zygomatic arch, infratemporal fossa, infratemporal fossa, infratemporal fossa, pterygopalatine fossa, pterygopalatine fossa, pterygopalatine fossa, pterygomaxillary fissure, pterygomaxillary fissure, pterygomaxillary fissure, normobusculus, 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 jugular foramen, jugular foramen, jugular foramen, incisive canal, incisive canal, incisive canal, incisive foramen, incisive foramen, incisive foramen, torus palatinus, torus palatinus, torus palatinus, palato-vaginal canal, palato-vaginal canal, palato-vaginal canal, vomerovaginal canal, vomerovaginal canal, vomerovaginal canal, vomerorostral canal, vomerorostral canal, vomerorostral canal, sphenopetrous fissure, sphenopetrous fissure, sphenopetrous fissure, petrooccipital fissure, petrooccipital fissure, petrooccipital fissure, foramen lacerum, foramen lacerum, foramen lacerum, bony palo, bony palo, bony palo, greater palatine canal, greater palatine canal, greater palatine canal, greater palatine foramen, greater palatine foramen, greater palatine foramen, lesser palatine foramen, lesser palatine foramen, lesser palatine foramen, incisive fossa, incisive fossa, incisive fossa, bones of skull, bones of skull, bones of skull, neurocranium, 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 calvaria, 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 parietal bone, parietal bone, parietal bone, internal surface, internal surface, internal surface, squamous border, squamous border, squamous border, sagittal border, sagittal border, sagittal border, frontal border, frontal border, frontal border, frontal angle, frontal angle, frontal angle, occipital angle, occipital angle, occipital angle, sphenoidal angle, sphenoidal angle, sphenoidal angle, mastoid angle, mastoid angle, mastoid angle, parietal foramen, parietal foramen, parietal foramen, groove. For sigmoid sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, groove for a superior sagittal sinus, groove for a superior sagittal sinus, groove for a superior sagittal sinus, groove for middle meningeal artery, groove for middle meningeal artery, groove for middle meningeal artery, external surface, external surface, external surface, superior temporal line, superior temporal line, superior temporal line, inferior temporal line, inferior temporal line, inferior temporal line, parietal eminence, parietal eminence, parietal eminence, occipital border, occipital border, occipital border, frontal bone, frontal bone, frontal bone, scama of frontal bone, scama of frontal bone, scama of frontal bone, frontal notch, frontal notch, frontal notch, frontal foramen, frontal foramen, frontal foramen, temporal surface, temporal surface, temporal surface, parietal border, parietal border, parietal border, temporal line, temporal line, temporal line, zygomatic process, zygomatic process, zygomatic process, internal surface, internal surface, internal surface, frontal crest, frontal crest, frontal crest, groove. For superior sagittal sinus, groove for a superior sagittal sinus, groove for a superior sagittal sinus, foramen scium, foramen scium, foramen scium, external surface, external surface, external surface, mtopic suture, mtopic suture, mtopic suture, nasal part, nasal part, nasal part, nasal spine, nasal spine, nasal spine, nasal border, nasal border, nasal border, orbital part, orbital part, orbital part, orbital surface, orbital surface, orbital surface, trochlear spine, trochlear spine, trochlear spine, trochlear fovea, trochlear fovea, trochlear fovea, ethmoidal foramina, ethmoidal foramina, ethmoidal foramina, fossa for lacrimal gland, fossa for lacrimal gland, fossa for lacrimal gland, frontal eminence, frontal eminence, frontal eminence, ethmoidal notch, ethmoidal notch, ethmoidal notch, frontal sinus, frontal sinus, frontal sinus, aperture of frontal sinus, aperture of frontal sinus, aperture of frontal sinus, septum of frontal sinus, septum of frontal sinus, septum of frontal sinus, superciliary arch, superciliary arch, superciliary arch, glabella, 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 frontal suture, frontal suture, frontal suture, supraorbital margin, supraorbital margin, supraorbital margin, supraorbital notch, supraorbital notch, supraorbital notch, supraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen, scama of occipital bone, scama of occipital bone, scama of occipital bone, scama of temporal bone, scama of temporal bone, scama of temporal bone, chondrocranium, 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 occipital bone, occipital bone, occipital bone, foramen magnum, foramen magnum, foramen magnum, mastoid border, mastoid border, mastoid border, lambdoid border, lambdoid border, lambdoid border, interparietal bone, interparietal bone, interparietal bone, occipital condyle, occipital condyle, occipital condyle, condyloid canal, condyloid canal, condyloid canal, hypoglossal canal, hypoglossal canal, hypoglossal canal, condyloid fossa, condyloid fossa, condyloid fossa, jugular tubercle, jugular tubercle, jugular tubercle, jugular notch, jugular notch, jugular notch, jugular process, jugular process, jugular process, Bayesian, 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 intrajugular process, intrajugular process, intrajugular process, external occipital protuberance, external occipital protuberance, external occipital protuberance, external occipital crest, external occipital crest, external occipital crest, highest knuckle line, highest knuckle line, highest knuckle line, superior knuckle line, superior knuckle line, superior knuckle line, inferior knuckle line, inferior knuckle line, inferior knuckle line, planum occipital, planum occipital, planum occipital, eminentia cruciata, eminentia cruciata, eminentia cruciata, internal occipital protuberance, internal occipital protuberance, internal occipital protuberance, internal occipital crest, internal occipital crest, internal occipital crest, opisthen, 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 groove 4 transverse sinus, groove 4 transverse sinus, groove 4 transverse sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, groove for occipital sinus, groove for occipital sinus, groove for occipital sinus, paramastoid process, paramastoid process, paramastoid process, cerebral fossa, cerebral fossa, cerebral fossa, cerebellar fossa, cerebellar fossa, cerebellar fossa, buscular part, buscular part, buscular part, clivus, 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 pharyngeal tubercle, pharyngeal tubercle, pharyngeal tubercle, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, lateral part, lateral part, lateral part, scama of occipital bone, scama of occipital bone, scama of occipital bone, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, body, 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 carotid sulcus, carotid sulcus, carotid sulcus, sphenoidal lingula, sphenoidal lingula, sphenoidal lingula, sphenoidal crest, sphenoidal crest, sphenoidal crest, sphenoidal rostrum, sphenoidal rostrum, sphenoidal rostrum, sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, septum of sphenoidal sinus, septum of sphenoidal sinus, septum of sphenoidal sinus, aperture of sphenoidal sinus, aperture of sphenoidal sinus, aperture of sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal conchae, sphenoidal conchae, sphenoidal conchae, lesser wing, lesser wing, lesser wing, optic canal, optic canal, optic canal, sphenoidal yoke, sphenoidal yoke, sphenoidal yoke, anterior clinoid process, anterior clinoid process, anterior clinoid process, superior orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure, great wing, great wing, great wing, cerebral surface, cerebral surface, cerebral surface, temporal surface, temporal surface, temporal surface, maxillary surface, maxillary surface, maxillary surface, orbital surface, orbital surface, orbital surface, zygomatic border, zygomatic border, zygomatic border, frontal border, frontal border, frontal border, parietal border, parietal border, parietal border, chiasmatic groove, chiasmatic groove, chiasmatic groove, squamous border, squamous border, squamous border, infratemporal crest, infratemporal crest, infratemporal crest, foramen rotundum, foramen rotundum, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen ovale, foramen ovale, emissary sphenoidal foramen, emissary sphenoidal foramen, emissary sphenoidal foramen, foramen sphenosium, foramen sphenosium, foramen sphenosium, foramen petrosium, foramen petrosium, foramen petrosium, sphenoidal spine, sphenoidal spine, sphenoidal spine, groove for auditory tube, groove for auditory tube, groove for auditory tube, pterygoid process, pterygoid process, pterygoid process, cella turcica, cella turcica, cella turcica, lateral plate, lateral plate, lateral plate, medial plate, medial plate, medial plate, pterygoid notch, pterygoid notch, pterygoid notch, pterygoid fossa, pterygoid fossa, pterygoid fossa, scaphifoid fossa, scaphifoid fossa, scaphifoid fossa, vaginal process, vaginal process, vaginal process, palato-vaginal groove, palato-vaginal groove, palato-vaginal groove, vomerovaginal groove, vomerovaginal groove, vomerovaginal groove, pterygoid hamless, pterygoid hamless, pterygoid hamless, sulcus of pterygoid hamless, sulcus of pterygoid hamless, sulcus of pterygoid hamless, tuberculum celli, tuberculum celli, tuberculum celli, pterygoid canal, pterygoid canal, pterygoid canal, pterygospinous process, pterygospinous process, pterygospinous process, middle clinoid process, middle clinoid process, middle clinoid process, hypophyll fossa, hypophyll fossa, hypophyll fossa, dorsum celli, dorsum celli, dorsum celli, posterior clinoid process, posterior clinoid process, posterior clinoid process, temporal bone, temporal bone, temporal bone, petromastoid part, petromastoid part, petromastoid part, canaliculus of chorda tympani, canaliculus of chorda tympani, canaliculus of chorda tympani, apex of petrous portion, apex of petrous portion, apex of petrous portion, carotid canal, carotid canal, carotid canal, carotid-tympanic canal, carotid-tympanic canal, carotid-tympanic canal, mosquito-tubal canal, mosquito-tubal canal, mosquito-tubal canal, semicanal for tensor tympani muscle, semicanal for tensor tympani muscle, semicanal for tensor tympani muscle, semicanal for auditory tube, semicanal for auditory tube, semicanal for auditory tube, septum of mosquito-tubal canal, septum of mosquito-tubal canal, septum of mosquito-tubal canal, anterior surface of petrous portion, anterior surface of petrous portion, anterior surface of petrous portion, tegmen tympani, tegmen tympani, tegmen tympani, occipital border, occipital border, occipital border, arcuate eminence, arcuate eminence, arcuate eminence, hiatus of facial canal, hiatus of facial canal, hiatus of facial canal, groove for greater petrosal nerve, groove for greater petrosal nerve, groove for greater petrosal nerve, hiatus of canal for lesser petrosal nerve, hiatus of canal for lesser petrosal nerve, hiatus of canal for lesser petrosal nerve, groove for lesser petrosal nerve, groove for lesser petrosal nerve, groove for lesser petrosal nerve, trigeminal impression, trigeminal impression, trigeminal impression, superior border of petrous portion, superior border of petrous portion, superior border of petrous portion, groove for a superior petrosal sinus, groove for a superior petrosal sinus, groove for a superior petrosal sinus, posterior surface of petrous portion, posterior surface of petrous portion, posterior surface of petrous portion, internal acoustic pore, internal acoustic pore, internal acoustic pore, mastoid process, mastoid process, mastoid process, internal acoustic meatus, internal acoustic meatus, internal acoustic meatus, subarcuate fossa, subarcuate fossa, subarcuate fossa, vestibular aqueduct, vestibular aqueduct, vestibular aqueduct, external aperture of vestibular aqueduct, external aperture of vestibular aqueduct, external aperture of vestibular aqueduct, posterior border of petrous portion, posterior border of petrous portion, posterior border of petrous portion, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, groove for inferior petrosal sinus, jugular notch, jugular notch, jugular notch, intrajugular process, intrajugular process, intrajugular process, cochlear aqueduct, cochlear aqueduct, cochlear aqueduct, external aperture of cochlear aqueduct, external aperture of cochlear aqueduct, external aperture of cochlear aqueduct, mastoid notch, mastoid notch, mastoid notch, inferior surface of petrous portion, inferior surface of petrous portion, inferior surface of petrous portion, jugular fossa, jugular fossa, jugular fossa, cochlear canaliculus, cochlear canaliculus, cochlear canaliculus, external aperture of cochlear canaliculus, external aperture of cochlear canaliculus, external aperture of cochlear canaliculus, mastoid canaliculus, mastoid canaliculus, mastoid canaliculus, jugular notch, jugular notch, jugular notch, styloid process, styloid process, styloid process, stylomastoid foramen, stylomastoid foramen, stylomastoid foramen, tympanic canaliculus, tympanic canaliculus, tympanic canaliculus, petrosal fasciula, petrosal fasciula, petrosal fasciula, groove for sigmoid sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, tympanic cavity, tympanic cavity, tympanic cavity, petrotympanic fissure, petrotympanic fissure, petrotympanic fissure, petrosquamous fissure, petrosquamous fissure, petrosquamous fissure, tympanomastoid fissure, tympanomastoid fissure, tympanomastoid fissure, tympanosquamous fissure, tympanosquamous fissure, tympanosquamous fissure, tympanic part, tympanic part, tympanic part, tympanic ring, tympanic ring, tympanic ring, external acoustic meatus, external acoustic meatus, external acoustic meatus, external acoustic pore, external acoustic pore, external acoustic pore, greater tympanic spine, greater tympanic spine, greater tympanic spine, groove for occipital artery, groove for occipital artery, groove for occipital artery, lesser tympanic spine, lesser tympanic spine, lesser tympanic spine, tympanic groove, tympanic groove, tympanic groove, tympanic notch, tympanic notch, tympanic notch, sheath of styloid process, sheath of styloid process, sheath of styloid process, scama of temporal bone, scama of temporal bone, scama of temporal bone, parietal border, parietal border, parietal border, parietal notch, parietal notch, parietal notch, sphenoidal border, sphenoidal border, sphenoidal border, temporal surface, temporal surface, temporal surface, groove for middle temporal artery, groove for middle temporal artery, groove for middle temporal artery, mastoid foramen, mastoid foramen, mastoid foramen, zygomatic process, zygomatic process, zygomatic process, suprametal crest, suprametal crest, suprametal crest, suprametal fovea, suprametal fovea, suprametal fovea, suprametal spine, suprametal spine, suprametal spine, mandibular fossa, mandibular fossa, mandibular fossa, articular surface, articular surface, articular surface, articular tubercle, articular tubercle, articular tubercle, cerebral surface, cerebral surface, cerebral surface, facial canal, facial canal, facial canal, geniculum of facial canal, geniculum of facial canal, geniculum of facial canal, ethmoid bone, ethmoid bone, ethmoid bone, cribriform plate, cribriform plate, cribriform plate, supreme nasal concha, supreme nasal concha, supreme nasal concha, superior nasal concha, superior nasal concha, superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, middle nasal concha, middle nasal concha, ethmoidal bulla, ethmoidal bulla, ethmoidal bulla, uncinate process, uncinate process, uncinate process, ethmoidal infundibulum, ethmoidal infundibulum, ethmoidal infundibulum, semilunar hiatus, semilunar hiatus, semilunar hiatus, olfactory foramina, olfactory foramina, olfactory foramina, crista galli, crista galli, crista galli, ali of crista galli, ali of crista galli, ali of crista galli, perpendicular plate, perpendicular plate, perpendicular plate, ethmoidal labyrinth, ethmoidal labyrinth, ethmoidal labyrinth, ethmoidal cells, ethmoidal cells, ethmoidal cells, orbital plate, orbital plate, orbital plate, ethmoidal foramina, ethmoidal foramina, ethmoidal foramina, facial cranium, viscera cranium, facial cranium, viscera cranium, facial cranium, viscera cranium, inferior nasal concha, inferior nasal concha, inferior nasal concha. Lacrimal process, lacrimal process, lacrimal process, maxillary process, maxillary process, maxillary process, ethmoidal process, ethmoidal process, ethmoidal process, auditory ossicles, auditory ossicles, auditory ossicles, lacrimal bone, lacrimal bone, lacrimal bone, posterior lacrimal crest, posterior lacrimal crest, posterior lacrimal crest, lacrimal hamlus, lacrimal hamlus, lacrimal hamlus, lacrimal groove, lacrimal groove, lacrimal groove, nasal bone, nasal bone, nasal bone, ethmoidal groove, ethmoidal groove, ethmoidal groove, vascular foramen, vascular foramen, vascular foramen, vomer, 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 ala vomer, ala vomer, ala vomer, groove for nasopalatine nerve, groove for nasopalatine nerve, groove for nasopalatine nerve, posterior border of vomer, posterior border of vomer, posterior border of vomer, pars conformis, pars conformis, pars conformis, maxilla, 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 body of maxilla, body of maxilla, body of maxilla, anterior nasal spine, anterior nasal spine, anterior nasal spine, zygomatico-maxillary suture, zygomatico-maxillary suture, zygomatico-maxillary suture. Infratemporal surface, infratemporal surface, infratemporal surface, alveolar foramina, alveolar foramina, alveolar foramina, alveolar canal, alveolar canal, alveolar canal, maxillary tuberosity, maxillary tuberosity, maxillary tuberosity, nasal surface, nasal surface, nasal surface, lacrimal groove, lacrimal groove, lacrimal groove, conchal crest, conchal crest, conchal crest, lacrimal border, lacrimal border, lacrimal border, orbital surface, orbital surface, orbital surface, maxillary hiatus, maxillary hiatus, maxillary hiatus, greater palatine groove, greater palatine groove, greater palatine groove, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, frontal process, frontal process, frontal process, anterior lacrimal crest, anterior lacrimal crest, anterior lacrimal crest, lacrimal notch, lacrimal notch, lacrimal notch, ethmoidal crest, ethmoidal crest, ethmoidal crest, zygomatic process, zygomatic process, zygomatic process, palatine process, palatine process, palatine process, nasal crest, nasal crest, nasal crest, infraorbital canal, infraorbital canal, infraorbital canal, incisive bone, incisive bone, incisive bone, incisive canal, incisive canal, incisive canal, incisive suture, incisive suture, incisive suture, palatine spines, palatine spines, palatine spines, palatine grooves, palatine grooves, palatine grooves, alveolar process, alveolar process, alveolar process, alveolar arch, alveolar arch, alveolar arch, dental alveoli, dental alveoli, dental alveoli, interovular septum, interovular septum, interovular septum, interradicular septum, interradicular septum, interradicular septum, infraorbital groove, infraorbital groove, infraorbital groove, alveolar yolks, alveolar yolks, alveolar yolks, incisive foramen, incisive foramen, incisive foramen, infraorbital margin, infraorbital margin, infraorbital margin, anterior surface, anterior surface, anterior surface, infraorbital foramen, infraorbital foramen, infraorbital foramen, canine fossa, canine fossa, canine fossa, nasal notch, nasal notch, nasal notch, palatine bone, palatine bone, palatine bone, perpendicular plate, perpendicular plate, perpendicular plate, orbital process, orbital process, orbital process, sphenoidal process, sphenoidal process, sphenoidal process, horizontal plate, horizontal plate, horizontal plate, nasal surface, nasal surface, nasal surface, palatine surface, palatine surface, palatine surface, lesser palatine foramina, lesser palatine foramina, lesser palatine foramina, posterior nasal spine, posterior nasal spine, posterior nasal spine, nasal crest, nasal crest, nasal crest, palatine crest, palatine crest, palatine crest, nasal surface, nasal surface, nasal surface, maxillary surface, maxillary surface, maxillary surface, sphenopalatine notch, sphenopalatine notch, sphenopalatine notch, greater palatine groove, greater palatine groove, greater palatine groove, pyramidal process, pyramidal process, pyramidal process, lesser palatine canal, lesser palatine canal, lesser palatine canal, conchal crest, conchal crest, conchal crest, ethmoidal crest, ethmoidal crest, ethmoidal crest, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, lateral surface, lateral surface, lateral surface, zygomatico-temporal foramen, zygomatico-temporal foramen, zygomatico-temporal foramen, temporal surface, temporal surface, temporal surface, orbital surface, orbital surface, orbital surface, temporal process, temporal process, temporal process, frontal process, frontal process, frontal process, orbital eminence, orbital eminence, orbital eminence, marginal tubercle, marginal tubercle, marginal tubercle, zygomatico-orbital foramen, zygomatico-orbital foramen, zygomatico-orbital foramen, zygomatico-facial foramen, zygomatico-facial foramen, zygomatico-facial foramen, mandible, 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 body of mandible, body of mandible, body of mandible, mylohyoid line, mylohyoid line, mylohyoid line, torus mandibularis, torus mandibularis, torus mandibularis, sublingual fossa, sublingual fossa, sublingual fossa, submandibular fossa, submandibular fossa, submandibular fossa, alveolar part, alveolar part, alveolar part, alveolar arch, alveolar arch, alveolar arch, dental alveoli, dental alveoli, dental alveoli, interovular septum, interovular septum, interovular septum, interradicular septum, interradicular septum, interradicular septum, alveolar yolks, alveolar yolks, alveolar yolks, base of mandible, base of mandible, base of mandible, ramus of mandible, ramus of mandible, ramus of mandible, mandibular angle, mandibular angle, mandibular angle, masseteric tuberosity, masseteric tuberosity, masseteric tuberosity, pterygoid tuberosity, pterygoid tuberosity, pterygoid tuberosity, mandibular foramen, mandibular foramen, mandibular foramen, lingula of mandible, lingula of mandible, lingula of mandible, mandibular canal, mandibular canal, mandibular canal, mylohyoid groove, mylohyoid groove, mylohyoid groove, corninoid process, corninoid process, corninoid process, temporal crest, temporal crest, temporal crest, symphysis mente, symphysis mente, symphysis mente, mandibular notch, mandibular notch, mandibular notch, condylar process, condylar process, condylar process, head of mandible, head of mandible, head of mandible, neck of mandible, neck of mandible, neck of mandible, pterygoid fovea, pterygoid fovea, pterygoid fovea, mental protuberance, mental protuberance, mental protuberance, mental tubercle, mental tubercle, mental tubercle, mental foramen, mental foramen, mental foramen, oblique line, oblique line, oblique line, digastric fossa, digastric fossa, digastric fossa, mental spine, mental spine, mental spine, hyoid bone, hyoid bone, hyoid bone, body of hyoid bone, body of hyoid bone, body of hyoid bone, lesser horn, lesser horn, lesser horn, greater horn, greater horn, greater horn, vertebral column, vertebral column, vertebral column, vertebra, 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 vertebral canal, vertebral canal, vertebral canal, superior vertebral notch, superior vertebral notch, superior vertebral notch, inferior vertebral notch, inferior vertebral notch, inferior vertebral notch, vertebral foramen, vertebral foramen, vertebral foramen, spinous process, spinous process, spinous process, transverse process, transverse process, transverse process, costal process, costal process, costal process, superior articular process, superior articular process, superior articular process, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, body of vertebra, body of vertebra, body of vertebra, intervertebral surface, intervertebral surface, intervertebral surface, neurocentral lip, neurocentral lip, neurocentral lip, arch of vertebra, arch of vertebra, arch of vertebra, pedicle of vertebral arch, pedicle of vertebral arch, pedicle of vertebral arch, lamina of vertebral arch, lamina of vertebral arch, lamina of vertebral arch, neurocentral junction, neurocentral junction, neurocentral junction, intervertebral foramen, intervertebral foramen, intervertebral foramen, cervical vertebrae first seventh, cervical vertebrae first seventh, cervical vertebrae first seventh, uncal process, uncal process, uncal process, foramen transversarium, foramen transversarium, foramen transversarium, anterior tubercle, anterior tubercle, anterior tubercle, posterior tubercle, posterior tubercle, posterior tubercle, groove for spinal nerve, groove for spinal nerve, groove for spinal nerve, netless, first cervical vertebra, netless, first cervical vertebra, netless, first cervical vertebra, lateral mass, lateral mass, lateral mass, superior articular surface, superior articular surface, superior articular surface, inferior articular surface, inferior articular surface, inferior articular surface, anterior arch, anterior arch, anterior arch, fovea dentis, fovea dentis, fovea dentis, anterior tubercle, anterior tubercle, anterior tubercle, posterior arch, posterior arch, posterior arch, groove for vertebral artery, groove for vertebral artery, groove for vertebral artery, posterior tubercle, posterior tubercle, posterior tubercle, axis, second cervical vertebra, axis, second cervical vertebra, axis, second cervical vertebra, dens, odontoid process, dens, odontoid process, dens, odontoid process, apex of dens, apex of dens, apex of dens, anterior articular surface, anterior articular surface, anterior articular surface, posterior articular surface, posterior articular surface, posterior articular surface, vertebra prominence, seventh cervical vertebra, vertebra prominence, seventh cervical vertebra, vertebra prominence, seventh cervical vertebra, thoracic vertebrae first 12th, thoracic vertebrae first 12th, thoracic vertebrae first 12th, superior costal facet, superior costal facet, superior costal facet, inferior costal facet, inferior costal facet, inferior costal facet, costal facet of transverse process, costal facet of transverse process, costal facet of transverse process, lumbar vertebrae first fifth, lumbar vertebrae first fifth, lumbar vertebrae first fifth, accessory process, accessory process, accessory process, mammillary process, mammillary process, mammillary process, sacrum, first fifth sacral vertebrae, sacrum, first fifth sacral vertebrae, Sacrum, first fifth sacral vertebrae, base of sacrum, base of sacrum, base of sacrum, intervertebral foramina, intervertebral foramina, intervertebral foramina, pelvic sacral foramina, pelvic sacral foramina, pelvic sacral foramina, dorsal surface, dorsal surface, dorsal surface, median sacral crest, median sacral crest, median sacral crest, dorsal sacral foramina, dorsal sacral foramina, dorsal sacral foramina. Intermediate sacral crest, intermediate sacral crest, intermediate sacral crest, lateral sacral crest, lateral sacral crest, lateral sacral crest, sacral cornua, sacral cornua, sacral cornua, sacral canal, sacral canal, sacral canal, sacral hiatus, sacral hiatus, sacral hiatus, promontory, 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 apex of sacrum, apex of sacrum, apex of sacrum, ala of sacrum, ala of sacrum, ala of sacrum, superior articular surface, superior articular surface, superior articular surface, lateral part, lateral part, lateral part, auricular surface, auricular surface, auricular surface, sacral tuberosity, sacral tuberosity, sacral tuberosity, pelvic surface, pelvic surface, pelvic surface, transverse line, transverse line, transverse line, coccyx, first fourth coccygeal vertebrae, coccyx, first fourth coccygeal vertebrae, coccyx, first fourth coccygeal vertebrae, coccygeal cornua, coccygeal cornua, coccygeal cornua, bones of thorax, bones of thorax, bones of thorax, ribs first twelfth, ribs first twelfth, ribs first twelfth, true. Ribs first seventh, true ribs first seventh, true ribs first seventh, false ribs 8/12, false ribs 8/12, false ribs 8/12, floating ribs 11/12, floating ribs 11/12, floating ribs 11/12, costal cartilage, costal cartilage, costal cartilage, rib, 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 head of rib, head of rib, head of rib, costal groove, costal groove, costal groove, cervical rib, cervical rib, cervical rib, first rib, first rib, first rib, tuberosity for scaliness anterior muscle, tuberosity for scaliness anterior muscle, tuberosity for scaliness anterior muscle, groove for subclavian artery, groove for subclavian artery, groove for subclavian artery, groove for subclavian vein, groove for subclavian vein, groove for subclavian vein, second rib, second rib, second rib, tuberosity for serratus anterior muscle, tuberosity for serratus anterior muscle, tuberosity for serratus anterior muscle, articular surface of head of rib, articular surface of head of rib, articular surface of head of rib, interarticular crest, interarticular crest, interarticular crest, neck of rib, neck of rib, neck of rib, crest of neck of rib, crest of neck of rib, crest of neck of rib, body of rib, body of rib, body of rib, tubercle of rib, tubercle of rib, tubercle of rib, articular surface of tubercle, articular surface of tubercle, articular surface of tubercle, angle of rib, angle of rib, angle of rib, sternum, 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 manubrium of sternum, manubrium of sternum, manubrium of sternum, clavicular notch, clavicular notch, clavicular notch, jugular notch, jugular notch, jugular notch, sternal angle, sternal angle, sternal angle, body of sternum, body of sternum, body of sternum, xiphoid process, xiphoid process, xiphoid process, costal notch, costal notch, costal notch, suprasternal bones, suprasternal bones, suprasternal bones, thoracic cage, thoracic cage, thoracic cage, thoracic cavity, thoracic cavity, thoracic cavity, superior thoracic aperture, thoracic inlet, superior thoracic aperture, thoracic inlet, superior thoracic aperture, thoracic inlet, inferior thoracic aperture, thoracic outlet, inferior thoracic aperture, thoracic outlet, inferior thoracic aperture, thoracic outlet, pulmonary groove, pulmonary groove, pulmonary groove, costal arch, costal arch, costal arch, intercostal space, intercostal space, intercostal space, infrasternal angle, infrasternal angle, infrasternal angle, appendicular skeleton, appendicular skeleton, appendicular skeleton, bones of upper limb, bones of upper limb, bones of upper limb, shoulder pectoral girdle, shoulder pectoral girdle, shoulder pectoral girdle, scapula, 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 costal surface, costal surface, costal surface, medial border, medial border, medial border, lateral border, lateral border, lateral border, superior border, superior border, superior border, scapular notch, scapular notch, scapular notch, inferior angle, inferior angle, inferior angle, lateral angle, lateral angle, lateral angle, superior angle, superior angle, superior angle, glenoid cavity, glenoid cavity, glenoid cavity, supraglenoid tubercle, supraglenoid tubercle, supraglenoid tubercle, infraglenoid tubercle, infraglenoid tubercle, infraglenoid tubercle, subscapular fossa, subscapular fossa, subscapular fossa, neck of scapula, neck of scapula, neck of scapula, coracoid process, coracoid process, coracoid process, dorsal surface, dorsal surface, dorsal surface, spine of scapula, spine of scapula, spine of scapula, supraspinatus fossa, supraspinatus fossa, supraspinatus fossa, infraspinatus fossa, infraspinatus fossa, infraspinatus fossa. Acromion, 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 acromial facet, acromial facet, acromial facet, acromial angle, acromial angle, acromial angle, clavicle, 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 sternal end, sternal end, sternal end, trapezoid line, trapezoid line, trapezoid line, sternal articular facet, sternal articular facet, sternal articular facet, impression of costoclavicular ligament, impression of costoclavicular ligament, impression of costoclavicular ligament, body of clavicle, body of clavicle, body of clavicle, groove for subclavius muscle, groove for subclavius muscle, groove for subclavius muscle, acromial end, acromial end, acromial end, tuberosity for coracoclavicular ligament, tuberosity for coracoclavicular ligament, tuberosity for coracoclavicular ligament, acromial articular facet, acromial articular facet, acromial articular facet, conoid tubercle, conoid tubercle, conoid tubercle, bones of free upper limb, bones of free upper limb, bones of free upper limb, humerus, 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 head of humerus, head of humerus, head of humerus, enteromedial surface, enteromedial surface, enteromedial surface, anterolateral surface, anterolateral surface, anterolateral surface, dorsal surface, dorsal surface, dorsal surface, groove for radial nerve, groove for radial nerve, groove for radial nerve, medial border, medial border, medial border, medial supracondylar ridge, medial supracondylar ridge, medial supracondylar ridge, supracondylar process, supracondylar process, supracondylar process, lateral border, lateral border, lateral border, lateral supracondylar ridge, lateral supracondylar ridge, lateral supracondylar ridge, deltoid tuberosity, deltoid tuberosity, deltoid tuberosity, anatomical neck, anatomical neck, anatomical neck, condyle of humerus, condyle of humerus, condyle of humerus, capitulum of humerus, capitulum of humerus, capitulum of humerus, trochlea of humerus, trochlea of humerus, trochlea of humerus, olecranon fossa, olecranon fossa, olecranon fossa, cornoid fossa, cornoid fossa, cornoid fossa, radial fossa, radial fossa, radial fossa, medial epicondyle, medial epicondyle, medial epicondyle, groove for ulnar nerve, groove for ulnar nerve, groove for ulnar nerve, lateral epicondyle, lateral epicondyle, lateral epicondyle, surgical neck, surgical neck, surgical neck, greater tubercle, greater tubercle, greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, lesser tubercle, lesser tubercle, inner tubercular bicipital groove, inner tubercular bicipital groove, inner tubercular bicipital groove, crest of greater tubercle, crest of greater tubercle, crest of greater tubercle, crest of lesser tubercle, crest of lesser tubercle, crest of lesser tubercle, body of humerus, body of humerus, body of humerus, radius, 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 head of radius, head of radius, head of radius, pronator tuberosity, pronator tuberosity, pronator tuberosity, interosseous border, interosseous border, interosseous border, anterior border, anterior border, anterior border, posterior border, posterior border, posterior border, styloid process, styloid process, styloid process, dorsal tubercle, dorsal tubercle, dorsal tubercle, ulnar notch, ulnar notch, ulnar notch, carpal articular surface, carpal articular surface, carpal articular surface, articular fovea, articular fovea, articular fovea, articular circumference, articular circumference, articular circumference, neck of radius, neck of radius, neck of radius, body of radius, body of radius, body of radius, radial tuberosity, radial tuberosity, radial tuberosity, anterior surface, anterior surface, anterior surface, posterior surface, posterior surface, posterior surface, lateral surface, lateral surface, lateral surface, ulna, 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 olecranon, 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 interosseous border, interosseous border, interosseous border, posterior border, posterior border, posterior border, supinator crest, supinator crest, supinator crest, head of ulna, head of ulna, head of ulna, articular circumference, articular circumference, articular circumference, styloid process, styloid process, styloid process, cornoid process, cornoid process, cornoid process, tuberosity of ulna, tuberosity of ulna, tuberosity of ulna, trochlear notch, trochlear notch, trochlear notch, radial notch, radial notch, radial notch, body of ulna, body of ulna, body of ulna, anterior surface, anterior surface, anterior surface, posterior surface, posterior surface, posterior surface, medial surface, medial surface, medial surface.